In our case, we had a call center that, because of a portion of our business, was very temporary and periodic. So we ramp up a roughly 300-seat call center every year, but only during tax season. And every year prior to my coming to the bank, they, in order to provide desktops, a desktop environment for the seasonal workers that we hired for that call center, they would rent PCs. And the smallest amount of time that we could rent those PCs for was 6 months. And during my first year here at Republic, for that first tax season, I found out after the fact how much we paid to rent those PCs for 6 months, and it was approximately the same cost that we paid to lease a PC for 3 years. And we did that every year. And the only advantage that we gained in renting versus just leasing and keeping those PCs on staff on the desks was, logistics, really. So we didn't have to manage, treat, secure, and otherwise keep up with 300 PCs the other 9 months of the year. But we paid a pretty stiff penalty in cost. So in this particular case, the environment that the workers worked in was already fairly restricted, fairly static. So we knew what we had to deal with from a desktop environment. However, the cost was probably the single driving factor for that particular implementation. And then, along like Rick said as well, we had considerations during those times for desktop support as well. And moving to VDI for that environment allowed us to, I say dramatically, it was 1 or 2 people that we had to bring on just temporarily during that season to support those workers. But it allowed us to trim support costs, both from a personnel perspective as well as the time involved in our more permanent staff and the time they spent supporting that environment.
And did you see any sort of advantages or any savings, perhaps would be the best way to express that, in terms of your speed of reaction? I mean, you've talked about the flexibility there. Did you find you could actually onboard those temporary workers more quickly?
We did. Some of that was a secondary effect because we even more dramatically limited their working environment. So with the virtualized desktops, there's no persistence from day to day or even from session to session of the user's environment. So we dramatically limited their ability to change much, if anything, about their operating environment. So we were able to deliver a much more consistent operating environment and a much more stable operating environment from day to day. By the same token, we were able to train them, because of the way we could essentially build up and then throw away workstation sessions. We were able to train them on the actual sessions they were going to be using when they went to their desktop. So they didn't have to go sit in a training room and use a totally different PC, set up a totally different way. So they got the same desktop each time. And then, from a support perspective, the way we built that environment, again, no persistence from session to session. So if a user has trouble with their particular desktop, something stops working or whatever reason, other than a physical problem like a keyboard, we have horror stories about keyboards and mice and the things that have happened to those. But in general, if a user has an issue with a part of their session, all they have to do, because of the way we have it configured at this time, is log off and log back in, and they get a whole brand new clean desktop, clean session, and they fire off and go start working again.